What have you to say to the begrudgers who talk about the Yeats industry and the Joyce industry?
It's better than the munitions industry, Seamus. Here are Yeats and Joyce, who are two of the most sensitive and complicated minds of the century. They appear to understand us. Why shouldn't we try to understand them?
Well, you have devoted a lifetime almost to understanding them. Have there been any particular rewards in that for you?
Well, there have been occasional moments when it seems to me that I have understood things suddenly and completely, such as the Byzantine poems or the ending of the Dead or the ending of Ulysses, and these moments have been rewarding.
Well, that's mostly in the critical area and interpretation, but I suppose people would think of you as preeminently the biographer of Joyce. Is there anything in particular in biography that yields pleasure?
Well, you do have the sense that you are discovering things which not only are interesting in themselves, but if you did not discover them, they might well not be ever found out because the witnesses are unfortunately disappearing. And that's one of the great pleasures of biography.
Watch your step, Dick. I think we'll go over to the edge of the cliff here.
Fine, I'd like that.
Richard Ellman is Goldsmith Professor at the University of Oxford, a lecturer and editor of international repute. He has published standard anthologies of American and English poetry, but it is as the biographer and critic of three great modern Irish writers, James Joyce, W.B. Yeats, and Oscar Wilde, that he has established his preeminent authority. Yet Ellman began with no particular Irish connections. Born in Detroit, he grew up in the melting pot of American society in the 1920s and was educated and later taught at various American universities. So it is not the ethnic qualities of Irish writers that particularly interest him. Rather, he focuses on the way their imaginations go beyond their specific Irish experience.
Well, just to open the path in, Dick, I was wondering how, in the beginning, you got interested in Irish writing. Was it an obsession from the start, or was it something that you stumbled into by accident?
I think that it probably began when I was growing up, when there was a set of Oscar Wilde in the house, and shortly after reaching puberty, I think I must have decided that this was for me, and I enjoyed it very much. Not only the picture of Dorian Gray, which evoked my as yet uncommitted sins, but all sorts of other elegances of phrase that really delighted me.
One of the myths we have about ourselves in this country, and it may be based on some really true thing that is common in the Irish mind, is that we have a very strong sense of place. And actually just sitting here on Howth Head, it strikes me that there may be a lot in it, because Howth is one of the focal points of the imagination, of the literary imagination in the country, I would say, insofar as it appears as Bin Éidir in a lot of Irish poetry and praise poetry of place. And the fact, I think, that it changed its name from Bin Éidir to Howth, that the Viking people felt it necessary to name it, and the name stuck, shows that it's preeminent in some way in the topographical mind. And then coming right up to the 20th century, you have Yeats spending part of his childhood here, and you have written yourself about how perhaps the childhood secrecies of living in a thicket, of going out and hiding himself around here, was important to him. And obviously, very important in Joyce, this particular territory, with the ending of Ulysses and Molly Bloom remembering being here with Bloom, and with Howth Head figuring as the head of the giant in Finnegan's Wake and so on. I'm just wondering if from your reading of the writers, Joyce and Yeats, to a lesser extent Wilde, whether that that sense of place, that sense of heritage in belonging to a place, where that strikes you as a significant part of their makeup.
Yes, in a sense, though it's clear they were both rather opposed to Ireland in many of its aspects. They were attached to particular places. They disapproved of particular people and institutions. It's a rather mixed business, isn't it? I suppose it was the complexity, the tension of that relationship between them and Ireland which generated a lot of their work. We don't have to think only of poems by Yeats, such as the one in which he speaks of great hatred, little room, or of Joyce's various attacks upon Ireland as an afterthought of Europe. Mm-hmm. There are, even if we don't consider those things, it's clear that they're totally involved with the situation in their native country, and that they have determined to make that the basis and center of their work. At the same time, their interests are constantly ranging beyond those things, so that they always seem to be half in the stream of European literature, even as they are connecting themselves with Irish thought.
Everybody who came within the orbit of Joyce and Yeats recognized that they were in the presence of something slightly other, you know. Or
yes.
Is that unfair?
No, I think that's true. Not discreditable to them, do you think?
No, not at all.
No. Well, most people work within a social context in which they have no very determined point of view. But Joyce was constantly working on these huge structures, and they were always in his mind, even in his ordinary life. And Yeats, too, had an enormous structure behind his poetry, so that, in a way, everything that happened to him necessarily had to be either incorporated in this structure or else rejected, or else the structure had to be modified to make it possible to include it. So I think that would be the reason why, to some extent, they seem, as Walter Pater said about someone, like men on a secret errand.
This was not, of course, Richard Ellman's first trip to Dublin. He first arrived in the city in the 1940s to pursue the ghost of W.B. Yeats and to meet and talk with the poet's widow. Since then, he returned often to walk in the footsteps of Joyce and Wilde, to interview those who knew them and visit places associated with their names, like Sandymount Green, near Yeats's birthplace on Sandymount Avenue.
Isn't it extraordinary that in the 19th century, when Irish literature was at such a low ebb, suddenly Yeats should arrive? What was it that made his advent so auspicious?
Well, I think it's difficult to say, as usual, to decide between the man and the moment. I think that in Yeats's, in the ground plan of his own sensibility, there was probably some kind of mirror image of the ground plan of the energies that were at work in 19th century Ireland. So taking the man himself, there is first of all, I would think, the purely objective artistic drive, which when he looked back as an artist into the 19th century in Ireland, there were efforts, especially in the poetry side, the politicised efforts of Davis, less politicised but equally patriotic, as were efforts of Mangan. He mentions them himself, and Ferguson. But he was aware that these writers as instruments, as artistic instruments to play an artistic role, weren't as well tuned as they might have been. And I think that he very deliberately set about tuning himself. So there was an artistic tradition which was impure, which he was aware that he could in some way refine. I mean, Philip Larkin has a nice image someplace about a poem. What makes a poem? It could be said also
it could be extended to apply to what makes a poet. He says a poem is made by the knife and fork. I mean, the fork holds down the material, and the knife is the sensibility that cuts it up. Well, I think Yeats, the fork part of Yeats, had a lot of experience under him. I mean, he had, as he says himself in the autobiographies, he had Ireland like soft wax at the death of Parnell, waiting for some kind of definition politically and artistically. He had the whole inherited incompleteness and broken nature of Irish, the rays of Ireland, the matter of Ireland, held under the fork. And then there was the knife of this artistic ambition and artistic capacity, which had been sharpened through, I think, all that the father gave him in terms of milieu and in terms of inheritance, and it went. I don't know, that's possibly too neatly expressed.
No, I like your culinary metaphor. What struck me, though, was something you said about his political life, and that made me remember that you wrote about Yeats as an example once. How would you describe the exemplary character of Yeats?
Well, in terms of of the writer conducting himself in a politicized milieu, I think what is exemplary about him is that Yeats becomes important within that milieu, not so much for what he says as for who he is. Now, what I mean is that within a culture, the poet, the most important thing for the poet is to establish authority. And Yeats had the gift of establishing authority by first of all, by achievement, but secondly, by a conduct which was majestic in some kind of way and overbearing to some extent, but based upon a belief in the culture. He could rebuke the culture because he was its most intense representative to some extent. And I think that the poet, in other words, has to not get caught in a position where he is answerable to the politician, but where in some way the politician is under his spiritual gaze. Now, that is what is exemplary about Yeats. It's also what's very difficult to achieve for a writer in contemporary things. But I guess we should pursue this sitting down take.
That would be fine. I suppose his authority derived in part from the fact that he shared the national fervor of many Irish people at the time, but also from his extraordinary mastery of his craft. I like to think of his organizing literary societies, both in Dublin and in London. In London, the lesson that he had to tell his compatriots who were aspiring to be poets was that they should be local and national. But when he was talking to the Irish Literary Society in Dublin, what he urged upon them was a mastery of their craft, the kind of thing that he found in the English poets of the time. So in a way, he was asking for a kind of blend of Irish feeling and English technique.
He is also prepared to affirm in a way that that English poets don't. I mean, there's a holding back, there's a literary manners about English poetry that somehow you feel Yeats has broken through. And
it's a hard-won affirmation, though, isn't it, today?
It is. I mean, it's... Well, I think he also strove to achieve that effect, didn't he? He said the sense of holding down great passion is what he strove for in writing of plays. It's hard won in his own life in that he overcomes certain aspects, first of all, of his personality, the shyness which it was there, and which in his social life he won the power over himself to affirm himself. He defined himself against England and against Ireland, and there's that hard-won quality. But I mean, the language itself, the way Yeats's words work, kind of interests me too, and it is a new kind of noise in English poetry and in Irish poetry. I mean, if you take Keats's autumn poem, "Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless," and so on.
There's terrific luxury between the words, and they're lingering among themselves. And there's a lot of English poetry has to do with that kind of melody where the words caress each other. If you take Yeats's autumn poem, if you like, the Wild Swans at Cull, the trees are in their autumn beauty. The woodland paths are dry. Under the October twilight, the water mirrors the still sky. Upon the brimming water, among the stones, are 59 swans. There's a kind of clarity and definiteness about each word that is held apart. There's a kind of stone-cutter's quality about the words.
Yes, they seem extraordinarily definite, as though Yeats was convinced that everyone wanted to know all about these woods and those swans.
How important do you think the submerged life that he had within the realms of magic and spiritual adventure, or perhaps I should say spiritualist adventure, there's one response which would say this is all mumbo jumbo, and you can imagine Auden and people of that generation dismissing the magical apparatus and sustenance. But I suspect that you wouldn't take this attitude at all.
No, I would feel that these were for him simply certain phenomena which demonstrated what he knew anyway, that the power of the mind was triumphant over the power of matter. I think that was something that he felt from the start, and that he simply labored to prove through many occult means, but always with the feeling that these were simply demonstrations, machine-like demonstrations of what he knew by instinct.
Oscar Wilde is the latest of Richard Ellmann's Irish subjects, and the one whose name comes up naturally in the quadrangle of Trinity College. Yet in spite of his education here, of the three writers, Wilde is perhaps the one least identified with Ireland and Dublin, the one most assimilated into the English tradition and into the glamour of London society in the 1890s.
Earlier on, Dick, you were pointing out quite rightly that Yeats's arena of operations had been London for a significant part of his life and his writing life. And yet there's absolutely no difficulty in thinking of him as an Irish writer. The case of Wilde, I think, is different, perhaps radically different, because people, while they will assent to the idea of him as coming from Ireland, I think they don't readily think of him as an Irish writer. Indeed, perhaps even they don't think of him as an Irish man. I mean, what's your response to that?
Well, here he was in Trinity College, of course, after going to Portora in the north. Trinity College for 3.5 years. He almost finished. You remember his professor Mahaffey said Oscar wasn't good enough for us here, so we sent him over to Oxford. When he got to Oxford, one might say that he was still faithful to his Irish background, which he never denied. His background was very Irish. His mother was Speranza, the famous poet of the 1840s, a patriotic poet, and his father, Sir William Wilde, was also brought into the nationalist movement by about 1850, was a very ardent student of Irish antiquities and Irish folklore, besides being a surgeon and the like. So that Wilde's background was really thoroughly Irish. When he went to Oxford, I suppose that he was determined to present himself first as an Irishman, but then to overwhelm the English at their own game. And he was able to do this. In a sense, he finished off the English by proving that he was a better writer and a better speaker than anybody they'd seen around for a long time. Of course, at the end they finished him off, but that's another story.
The thing that I think that Yeats had, admired about Wilde was the style of the performance, and I suppose Wilde was interested in style himself in all kinds of ways. I mean, Yeats says, Oscar said of the Irish, we are a race of brilliant failures. We Irish are too poetical to be poets, he says. We are a race of brilliant failures, but we are the greatest talkers since the Greeks.
I suppose it was premonitory of Wilde's later development, which was, of course, into the drama. In fact, he had been in the drama before, and his natural bent was towards putting talk into literature. And, of course, he was magnificent at that and unparalleled in his period, and perhaps for all time, at least with one of his plays. I think that the dramatic instinct was very strong in Wilde and strong in Yeats and in a way strong in Joyce, even though Joyce restrained himself from being dramatic in ordinary conversation in a way that the others did not. There's no doubt that if one wanted to hear good talk in the world, Wilde preeminently, but Yeats only a little bit behind him, were the great people to listen to in that period.
Yeah, Yeats talks about Wilde speaking, I mean, at his astonishment at finding the man speaking in these perfectly formed sentences, I think.
Yes, it's given rise to the notion that Wilde was interested in art for art's sake and that he was a proponent of that, and he lends some credence to that, but in fact he said himself that art for art's sake was really just something that the writer thinks about when he's writing, that he obviously is devoted to his artifact, whereas the general purpose of art is something different. Would you not say that that's true in relation to your own work?
Well, I feel that the phrase art for art's sake is often used dismissively by people who don't believe much in art. You know, they use it as saying, well, it's an art for art's sake thing, and it's used as a stick almost to beat art with, and I think when it's used that way, it's based upon an inadequate notion of what art can encompass. Whereas I think when Wilde uses it, he has a serious notion of the truth-telling and the subversive function that art can perform. I mean, art is a form of play, okay, and Wilde, God bless him, insisted on that, on the playfulness of the truth-telling that goes on in art, compared with, for example, Shaw, who's kind of furrowed brow, heckling you all the time. You know, actually, if I had my choice, I'd prefer to have written The Importance of Being Earnest to the whole of Shaw's works, but that's a different thing. In fact, it probably links up with Oscar's remark, you know, in all unimportant things of life, style, not sincerity, is the essential. In all important things in life, style, not sincerity, is the essential. And maybe people have taken him too much at his word, don't you think? I mean, that there was more to him than display and effrontery.
Well, I think so, and I remember what Borges said, that Wilde is always right, and it seems to me that usually that is, almost always that is true, at least almost always, and I think one of the ways in which one can test the truth of that is by the extraordinary number of translations of Wilde's writings. He's been translated into every language, and apparently his jokes work just as well in every language. A remark like, "I can resist anything but temptation," seems to work in Romanian or Basque just as well as in English. And the reason is, I think, that he was touching a very fundamental core of conventional thinking and of revulsion against conventional thinking. Your word subvert seems to me just right. He's always subverting our cliches and making us recognize that life is much more multifarious than the cliches would allow us to believe.
I remember feeling when I first read Richard Ellman's biography of James Joyce that it was a book as encyclopedic and full of facts as Joyce's own Ulysses. Yet by the shores of Dublin Bay, near the 40-foot swimming place and the Martello Tower in Sandy Cove, we didn't need to pursue the facts of Joyce's life again, for we were there among them. Instead, Joyce's politics, his relationship to the question of Ireland, came to the fore.
Joyce was also notoriously aloof and disdainful of engagement with local politics and even to some extent nationalist politics. Do you think his creation of a conscience, his liberation of the Irish psyche, part of that was involved with a liberation from political passion and disdain of it?
Well, I think that it wasn't quite like that. As a boy, of course, he must have been a Parnellite like his father. And some people think he remained a Parnellite all his life. But in fact, he did say of Parnell that he was more a skeleton than a man. And I think that his general attitude towards dead heroes was that one should not create effigies out of them. As a young man, he seems to have called himself a socialist. He repeatedly called himself a socialist in Trieste for several years. And then he seems to have become rather alienated from socialism. But it was at that time that he became interested in Arthur Griffith's Sinn Féin policy, particularly in its non-violent way. He liked the idea of the boycott of British goods. He said that the best war he knew was a war of the knife and fork. And that was what he was intending to support at that point. I think he had a good deal of sympathy for Griffith's non-violent position. Eventually, of course, that all changed. But there was a long period when it was clear that Joyce was very much in favor of Irish independence. When Ulysses was about to come out, he was delighted that Arthur Griffith was elected president of the Irish Free State as the first president. And I think he thought that perhaps the kind of emancipation that he tried to achieve through his books was something that Griffith tried to achieve through political means. I don't think he was quite so sanguine after Griffith's death and after the Civil War began and other things occurred.
Of course, he did live for a while in a tower built by the British Admiralty, so perhaps we should inspect that connection with the great oppressing power just now.
Yes, that's a good idea.
For people who have read Joyce's great novel, going into the Martello Tower is almost a kind of ritual. For although the author of Ulysses spent only a week in the place, his characters inhabit it in the imagination forever.
At this point, Dick, I'm always inclined to say Introibo ad altare Dei, because of that marvelous morning scene that they have up here, Buck
Yes,
Mulligan and Stephen.
That's the stairhead from which Buck Mulligan must have emerged, stately and plump.
Yes, and his bathrobe slightly buoyant on the wind. But that buoyancy seems to be the whole mark of that chapter, buoyancy of mood, fellows jumping, plunging into the sea, and terrific buoyancy of language too. I've often said, I'm sure many people, it's not a particularly original insight, the language of Ulysses, the language of almost the whole of Joyce, is much more animated and is much more full of relish of itself as language than most verse that's written, actually.
Yes, yes. He did talk about the lyric impulse as being vital to the expression of his whole personality in his work, which he was attempting. And I suppose, in some sense, he considered himself to be a poet. I noticed that you, as a poet, wrote a dialogue with the dead Joyce on the occasion of his centenary. I wonder if you think of him primarily as a poet.
Well, not really. I mean, I don't think of the verse that he wrote as being the thing that has the claim upon me or upon us. I mean, the poem I wrote was directed more to the old father, old artificer, the sense of him as a guardian spirit with the power to rebuke or to confer applause on you in your conduct. And what I was interested in the poem itself was his instructing me in how to conduct myself. But that's another matter, actually. But his own verse, I would say that it is primarily verse, that it is full of relish of the skills of verse making, and that there is a slightly ventriloquist aspect to it. In other words, it doesn't sound quite like the Joyce we know. The poems in chamber music, especially, which are very modulated, very beautiful, very literary, very full of dying falls and musical sighs, and allusive to the poetry that Joyce himself, like the airs of Dowland and the whole Elizabethan melodies. There is, as Yeats said about that poetry, that there is a sense of a young man practicing his instrument, and Yeats talks about the delicacy of it. But I mean, I really like Stanislaus' little flash of possessiveness and arrogance when he says, Yeats said delicacy, but I take credit for realizing that ruthlessness would be the mark of the brother's career, not delicacy. And
do you find any ruthlessness in his poetry at all?
Well, certainly not in the, as it were, in the official canon of poems penny each and chamber music, but the two unofficial poems, the poems in couplets, the angry angry poems, Gas from a Burner and the Holy Office, the Joyce that we know is there, the Joyce of anger and realism. You know, in fact, isn't Gas from a Burner is supposed to be spoken by the printer who would not print Dubliners, and one of the things he objects to in Joyce is Joyce's realism, the printing of the names of places, and
the Wellington Monument.
The Wellington Monument,
yes.
And Downes's Cake House. But it's that emotional realism as well as kind of naturalism that names places that I miss in the earlier verse. I know that you're not entirely satisfied with the description of Joyce as a realist from our previous conversations.
No, Joyce is a realist, but only up to a point. It's as if he wanted to present the facade of the external world in a fairly credible fashion. But when it comes down to it, he's much more interested in the internal world. And the internal world is not governed by space and time. In our thoughts, we can fly from one side of the world to the other in the twinkling of an eye, as he quotes in Ulysses. And this is what Bloom does. We feel that Bloom jumps from Gibraltar to Howth, and that Molly jumps from Gibraltar to Howth, as if that were conceivable when we know it isn't in actual fact. But in their minds they do. So that while we spoke of Yeats as the poet of the unseen world, and it would seem as if Joyce, in contrast, was the prosateur of the seen world. In fact, Joyce is quite as interested in the unseen world as Yeats is, and in fact the realm of imagination, as distinguished from simply responses to ordinary experience, is as pervasive in Joyce as it is in Yeats. For Yeats also has his moments of realism, doesn't he?
He certainly does, yeah. But the realm of imagination has so given a benediction to all this scene world that we can't actually look at Dublin Bay anymore from this particular vantage point without having it, you know...
Yes, it's been Joyceized.
Some sheen of Joyce upon
yes,
it. Yeah,
yes,
beautiful.
Yes. I wonder if we can see Bray Head as he claimed to see on that June day in 1904.
This lovely land that always sent its writers and artists to banishment, and in a spirit of Irish fun betrayed its own leaders one by one. With our backs to the tower and our faces towards Howth Head, it was tempting to allow Joyce's version of Irish literary and political history to stand as the last word on the whole subject. But perhaps it was too vindictive to be the whole truth. Well, there's no doubt about the writers in question. Their authority has been established, their achievement is recognised worldwide, and they have become, within the context of Ireland, I suppose, they have become national treasures. You go to an Irish hotel in London or New York, and you find Wilde and Yeats and Joyce, their profiles sitting above the drinkers. They have provided a passport for a commodity known as the Irish writer. They have, in some way, through their separate achievements, established Irishry almost as a diocese of the imagination, and yet that very homogenizing of the adjective Irish and linking it with literary excellence provokes, I think, often a reaction. It provoked in Patrick Kavanagh to say that Irishry was often a form of anti-art, a way of masquerading as being an artist without necessarily being one. And at times I want to react against this kind of hypnotic intonation of Irish writer and say, well, they're very different. I want to be very sectarian. I want to say Joyce is resentful, lapsed Catholic, angry, begrudger to some extent. Yeats is, to some extent, a Sligo bohemian magician, and Wilde is a Merrion Square showman. You know, I don't know whether that's possible.
It does seem as if as if those epithets can be ascribed, but I suppose only for a moment or two, and then one begins to reconsider and think that none of them are really represented by the parish in which they grew up, or even by the country in which they lived. That they had, from the beginning, it would seem, an inordinate ambition to go far beyond and to contribute something to the literature and thought of the world. Joyce used to say that literature is the eternal affirmation of the spirit of man, and there's some sense in which each of these writers does this, so that one feels one's heart lifted. For example, at the very name of Oscar Wilde, one feels one's heart lifted by the way in which Ulysses ends, or Finnegan's Wake, or any number of poems of Yeats. They do cease ultimately to be Irish. They become men.